The Locked Attic Letter. Chapter 1. The Old House's Silent Secret. At 68, Mrs. Eleanor Hale had lived in this quiet suburban wooden house for 42 years. Every plank of its weathered cedar siding, every uneven floorboard, every twist of climbing rose vines along the front porch carried fragments of the life she had shared with Thomas, fragments too tender to abandon. The neighborhood around them had shifted endlessly over the decades. Brand new modern townhomes sprouted on once empty meadows. Young families with screaming toddlers moved in next door, and the old general store at the end of the lane closed down to become a sleek coffee shop full of glass and metal. Yet this small wooden house stood unchanged, tucked behind a tall hedge of lavender, holding fast to the soft, slow rhythm of days long gone. Thomas had picked it himself, back when they were newlyweds and money was tight. Their combined wages barely covered rent and groceries back then, and every spare penny they scraped together went toward a place they could truly call their own. They toured a dozen cramped, dim rental apartments, first units with tiny windows that blocked all sunlight, buildings with thin walls that let every neighbor's argument drift through, yards no bigger than a doormat. When they stumbled across this aging cottage on a gray spring afternoon, Thomas had grabbed her hand tightly, his eyes bright with a quiet hope she still remembered clearly. He insisted on giving her a house with a garden. "You deserve your own field of roses," he had said. And every spring for 42 years, the roses bloomed like burning sunset clouds, crimson, peach, soft cream, deep magenta, layered petals spilling over stone edging, their sweet fragrance wrapping around the whole property from late May until the first cold frost of October. But the man who planted them, who knelt in damp soil each dawn to pull weeds and trim dead blooms, had been gone for 3 years now. 3 years since Thomas passed after a quiet battle with weak lungs that had slowly worn him thin. The house had grown strange to her, hollow around the edges, as if a vital piece of its warmth had been carved away. The old grandfather clock in the living room still ticked away, its deep, slow chime echoing through empty halls every hour, yet there was no one beside her to comment on how loud it sounded at midnight. The cheap ceramic teapot painted with wild daisies still sat in its usual place on the kitchen windowsill, waiting for a hand that would never lift it again. The worn leather armchair by the stone fireplace still held the permanent indentation of his broad shoulders and long legs, molded into the height by thousands of evenings spent reading newspapers and solving crosswords beside the flames. But no one looked up from the crinkled evening paper at dusk anymore and called out with a soft, fond smile, "Eleanor, your tea's getting cold." No one reached for her hand in the middle of sleepless nights, when grief or old aches kept her wide awake, and squeezed it 3 times, their private, unspoken secret code for "I love you." That small silent gesture had carried them through every hardship, job losses, the illness of her mother, the stressful years of raising 2 restless children, every quiet moment of doubt and weariness. Now her hands rested empty beneath the covers each night, aching for that gentle triple squeeze that would never come again. Her 2 children, Robert and Clara, had grown up and moved to the bustling city for work and life decades ago. Robert worked as an architectural draftsman in a downtown office, buried in blueprints and client meetings 6 days a week. Clara ran a small independent bookstore, her days filled with stacking novels and chatting with readers until closing time. They only came rushing back for Christmas and birthdays, like migratory birds that stayed briefly and then flew away, their city schedules always pulling them back before Eleanor could finish sharing all the small trivial stories she'd saved up to tell them. Every time they visited, they circled her gently, their voices laced with genuine worry, and urged her to leave the cottage behind for good. "Mom, the house is too damp, the wallpaper along the north wall is bubbling and peeling off the plaster. The wooden stairs creak so loud at night, anyone could trip and fall, and the old pipes keep acting up, leaking under the bathroom sink every few weeks. We lie awake worrying about you living here all alone, with no one to help if you sleep or get sick in the middle of the night. Come to the city with us, we can find you a ground floor apartment with an elevator. A building with a property manager who handles all repairs, and it'll be so much closer to both of us. We could stop by every evening for dinner. Eleanor refused every time, without hesitation, though she never spoke harshly to her children. She understood their fear, and her heart softened seeing how deeply they cared for her safety. Yet she could not bring herself to pack a single suitcase and walk out the front door for good. It wasn't stubbornness, nor was it a refusal to accept change or cling blindly to the past. She just couldn't explain the intangible, overwhelming feeling that clung to every wall and piece of furniture in this home. Every time she stood at the chipped porcelain kitchen sink washing dishes, her peripheral vision would catch a fleeting, vivid flicker of Thomas walking through the garden with a handful of freshly cut roses, clear morning dew still glistening thick on the soft petals, pausing to glance over at her kitchen window and grin. Every time she got up to use the bathroom at night and passed the tall antique oak mirror mounted on the upstairs landing, she half expected to see a familiar figure lingering behind her reflection, bending down to tuck her wool blanket tighter around her shoulders before she returned to bed. Every corner of this house held his shadow, etched into every memory woven into the walls. The spot where he'd taught Robert to ride a bike, the windowsill where he'd left Clara's childhood stuffed rabbit after she cried over losing it, the fireplace where they'd wrapped themselves in blankets to watch snowfall every winter. She was terrified that if she left this house behind, closed its front door and never returned, all those faint, precious shadows would fade away completely, erased by time and unfamiliar city walls, leaving nothing of their shared life to hold on to. One rainy autumn afternoon arrived heavy and unrelenting, the sky hung low and thick overhead, a flat murky gray as an old cotton cloth soaked through and left to drip over the treetops. Thunder rumbled from far off in the distance, low and drawn out, like someone letting out a deep, weary sigh trapped deep within the earth. Gusts of sharp autumn wind whipped through the rose bushes out front, driving fat, heavy raindrops against the small attic window again and again, rattling its aged wooden frame with a faint, rhythmic squeak, as if something hidden away in the darkness above were gently knocking, begging to be let out after years of confinement. Eleanor spent the afternoon tidying the cluttered second-floor storage room, sorting through stacks of thick old wool blankets pulled down from high shelves to prepare for the coming bitter winter. She folded each blanket slowly and carefully, smoothing out every wrinkle before pressing them neatly into polished Camp Horwood chests lined with faded linen, the air thick with the musty, warm scent of aged woven fabric mixed with the sharp, clean aroma of camphor chips tucked between each layer. Her knees ached sharply as she bent over to lift the heavy folded textiles, stiff with age and years of minor joint pain, and she found herself mentally calculating that she would need to drag out her thickest down quilt from storage this year, the nights already growing far colder than they had in early September. Then a cold, sharp draft curled around from the far end of the narrow upstairs hallway, slipping cool against her bare ankles beneath her knit house slippers and making her whole body shiver involuntarily. She paused her folding, her hands frozen mid-motion atop a cream wool throw blanket, and lifted her head to follow the path of that strange chill drifting down the corridor. Her gaze drifted almost involuntarily toward the solid oak attic door standing silent at the very end of the corridor, its surface faded dark brown, fitted with a rusted iron padlock that had never once been unlocked in all her 42 years living in the cottage. For decades, that door had remained securely locked shut, sealed off from the rest of the house like a separate secret world Thomas guarded fiercely. He kept the single matching key hidden away inside his dented old iron storage box, tucked deep in the back of his study desk drawer, buried under a towering stack of heavy hardcover history books that no one else ever bothered to move. He never allowed the children to climb the narrow stairs leading upward, and he never spoke a single word about what items or memories were stored away above their heads behind that locked barrier. When Robert and Clara were small, curious children full of wild imagination, they would often stretch out flat on the wooden hallway floor, pressing their ears tight to the thin gap beneath the attic door, whispering wild guesses back and forth about hidden treasures locked away out of sight. Robert swore fiercely it held their grandfather's forgotten gold coins, stashed there during the war. Clara insisted it was their grandmother's glittering diamond necklace locked away for safekeeping, or maybe even a tattered pirate's treasure map marked with red ink. Every time they tugged at Thomas's sleeve and begged him to hand over the key so they could explore the mysterious attic together, he would shake his head gently, a quiet sorrow softening his smile, and repeat the same slow, careful words without fail. Some family secrets are best left untouched until the right time. Back then, Eleanor had brushed the whole mystery off as nothing more than a parent's gentle way of keeping two rambunctious young children from making a mess of the dusty, cramped attic space, filled with fragile old belongings that could easily break or tear. She never pressed him for further details, never snuck into his study to hunt for the hidden key, never lingered by the attic door trying to listen for faint sounds drifting down. She trusted Thomas as naturally and unconditionally as she trusted the sun to rise over the rose garden each morning, confident that whatever reason he had for locking the attic away was sensible and harmless. But on this gray, rain-soaked autumn afternoon, something strange and unforeseen happened that shattered 40 years of quiet containment. The relentless downpour had soaked the old wooden doorframe of the attic completely, rain seeping deep into every crack and grain of the timber. Over the years, the wood had swelled and contracted repeatedly with each changing season, bloating in humid summer heat, shrinking tight in dry winter cold until the rusted iron padlock that had held fast, unbroken for 40 long years, finally corroded through to its core. With a soft, faint click barely audible over the patter of rain outside, it sprang open on its own, the metal clasp falling loose against the wood frame. Through the thin crack that split the attic door open an inch, a narrow sliver of absolute darkness spilled out into the hallway, and a frigid cold draft heavy with the scent of fine dust, dry-aged timber, and decades of undisturbed silence drifted slowly down the wooden staircase toward Eleanor, like something that had been sleeping undisturbed for half a century finally letting out a long, quiet breath into the world below. Eleanor froze solid where she stood, her hands still resting lightly on the folded wool blanket in front of her. She stared unblinking at the half-open attic door at the end of the hall, her breath catching in her throat. Her heartbeat was not fast or panicked, but each heavy thump landed deep and painfully against her chest, slow and resounding. She was not afraid of shadows or hidden things, yet she felt a strange, subtle unease she had never experienced in all her 68 years of life, a disorienting shift as if the solid, familiar ground she had always stood on had suddenly cracked wide open beneath her feet, revealing unknown depths she'd never dared to consider. 40 years of locked, silent secrecy had broken wide open on this rainy, gray afternoon. What had her gentle, honest husband, the man who had never once lied to her, never hidden trivial troubles, always shared every worry and joy openly buried away in the attic for an entire lifetime, guarding it alone behind a rusted lock and a wall of unspoken silence? She set the folded wool blanket down gently atop the pile of textiles beside her feet, drew a deep, shaky breath to steady her racing heart, and began walking slowly toward the ajar attic door. Each step she took was light and hesitant, yet every single footfall landed squarely in time with the heavy pounding of her heart, echoing softly down the empty upstairs corridor as she drew closer to the dark mystery waiting above. Chapter 2, The Dusty Iron Box. Eleanor stood at the foot of the stairs for a long moment. Her fingers twisted loosely at the hem of her wool cardigan, a garment Thomas had gifted her 10 winters prior, its cuffs worn thin from years of constant fidgeting. Outside, the autumn rain refused to ease up. Sheets of gray water slid continuously down the sloped attic window, muffling every other sound until the whole house felt wrapped in a thick, damp blanket of quiet. She told herself there was no reason to be afraid. This was only their own attic, filled with old household junk they'd stowed away over decades, and yet her feet refused to move forward for minutes on end, anchored to the worn hallway floor by a tangled mix of curiosity and quiet dread. Her gaze drifted upward to the narrow wooden stairwell vanishing into shadow, and she found herself replaying every time Thomas had brushed off her casual questions about the space above. His expression soft yet guarded, as if a single careless word might unravel something fragile he'd spent his whole life safeguarding. Rainlight filtered through the cracked attic window, a thin, steady patter like someone whispering far away. Each drop hit the glass in a slow, monotonous rhythm, matching the slow thud of her pulse beneath her ribs. She finally lifted her foot and placed it on the first step. The old wood groaned beneath her weight, deep and hollow, as if protesting the first intrusion in decades. The stair planks had not borne human footsteps for 40 years. Dust had settled thick into every groove and joint, and faint cobwebs strung thin between the wooden balusters swayed gently when she shifted her weight, disturbed by the first warm breath to drift up the stairs in a lifetime. She gripped the rough wooden handrail for balance, its surface smooth in the spots Thomas had once gripped during quick trips up to store holiday decorations years ago, and rough and splintered everywhere else, neglected for far too long. The attic was dark. The only light came from the grimy little round window. Rain and gray sky mingled into a few slanted beams that fell across the floor, illuminating countless specks of dust drifting slowly in the air, like time itself made visible. The air smelled of dry timber, mixed with old paper, fabric, and something she couldn't name, the scent of undisturbed silence, decades thick and heavy as a quilt pressed at the bottom of a trunk. The atmosphere clung to her skin the second she fully crossed the threshold, cool and slightly clammy against her cheeks, carrying faint hints of cedar from old storage crates and the faint, stale sweetness of dried flower petals trapped between folded linens. The air was so still she could hear her own quiet breathing echoing off the sloped wooden walls, no hum of radiators, no distant tick of the living room clock to break the oppressive hush that had settled here for 40 long years. She stepped inside slowly, her old leather shoes making soft tapping sounds on the wooden floor, each echo sharp in the cramped space. The ceiling was low, and she had to stoop slightly, her gray hair brushing lightly against exposed wooden rafters crisscrossing overhead. Around her, cardboard boxes were piled haphazardly, some with collapsed corners, others sealed with yellowing tape that had dried brittle and cracked along every seam. Thomas's neat handwriting labeled each one, ink faded to pale brown after decades of exposure to cold and damp, old clothes, magazines, Christmas decorations, Robert's elementary school books. She paused to trace one label with her fingertip, remembering how carefully Thomas had tended to every small household task, never leaving clutter unmarked or disorganized, even when he rushed home late from work exhausted. It felt strange to see his meticulous order preserved in this forgotten room, untouched the day he locked the door and never returned. She opened one box. Inside were stacks of yellowed National Geographic magazines dated 1972, their glossy covers faded to dull sepia, dog-eared at the pages Thomas had lingered over during quiet weekend evenings. Another held the children's old sweaters, faded and worn, loose threads fraying at cuffs and hems, but folded with care as if someone had cherished them deeply and then tucked them away, never to be opened again. She ran a palm over a tiny faded blue knit jumper that had belonged to Robert when he was 3, recalling how he'd cried for days when he'd outgrown it, clinging to Thomas's leg and begging to keep the small worn garment close. She checked a few more boxes, a broken brass table lamp with a cracked ceramic shade, a cheap porcelain vase Clara had painted in art class at age 7, a rusted tin of assorted screws and nails Thomas had collected for home repairs, a stack of dog-eared cookbooks filled with Eleanor's handwritten recipe notes scrawled in the margins. Ordinary things. Nothing special, nothing hidden or mysterious, just fragments of an ordinary family's quiet, unremarkable daily life. A faint disappointment settled heavy in her chest. Perhaps there really was nothing after all. Perhaps the lock had just given way to age, eaten through by endless rain and winter frost. Perhaps Thomas truly had been too lazy to clean at the attic, leaving behind nothing more than discarded household clutter with no deeper secret attached. She let out a quiet, shaky exhale, her shoulders slumping with the weight of unmet expectation, and turned her gaze toward the stairwell, ready to fold the blankets back downstairs and forget the unlocked attic door entirely. She resolved to find a handyman in town the next morning to fit a brand new lock, sealing the room away once more just as Thomas had intended all those years ago. She was about to turn and leave when something in the farthest corner caught her eye, a stark contrast amid the dust-covered chaos that pulled her gaze back instantly, stopping her mid-step toward the stairs. In the deepest part of the attic, tucked away beneath the steepest slant of the roof where barely any rain light could reach, there was a clean wooden shelf. Unlike the cluttered boxes surrounding it, coated in layers of gray dust thick enough to write letters in, this shelf was completely free of dust, every plank smooth and pale, as if someone had wiped it clean not long ago. And on it sat a small black iron box, barely the size of a palm, small enough to fit entirely within the curve of two cupped hands. Its paint was chipped and peeling across every edge and corner, revealing dull gray-brown rusted metal beneath the flaking black coating. A small brass lock hung loosely from the metal clasp, tarnished dark green with oxidation from decades of damp air, but still intact, its metal loop firmly wrapped around the box's latch. It was so small, so ordinary at first glance, easy to overlook amid the towering piles of forgotten storage boxes. But it had been placed with such care, such solemnity, as if someone had set it there decades ago, knelt down to pat the lid gently with a tender palm, and whispered a silent goodbye before locking the attic door and walking away. Eleanor could almost picture Thomas standing in this very spot years ago, his expression solemn and grief-stricken as he set the tiny iron box down, knowing he would never open it again in his lifetime. Eleanor's hands began to tremble the longer she stared at the box, a faint, unsteady shiver spreading from her fingertips all the way up her arms to her shoulders. She had lived with Thomas for 45 years, sharing every sunrise and sunset, every joy and sorrow side by side. She knew every tiny, unchanging habit that made him who he was, how he kept loose silver change crumpled in his left trouser pocket for roadside flower vendors, how he stirred exactly half a spoon of white sugar into every cup of black tea he brewed each morning, how he hummed an off-key old folk song his own mother had taught him while pruning the rose bushes every single spring without fail. She knew every drawer, every hidden compartment in every piece of furniture they owned, every loose floorboard that creaked underfoot, and every hollow wall niche he used to store small trinkets. She even knew about the beat-up little tin box where he stashed his spare pocket money at the very bottom of his heavy oak desk, and the stack of handwritten love letters he'd penned to her during their courtship, carefully tucked behind the mirror of her bedroom vanity for her to find whenever she missed him. But she had never seen this iron box, never caught a glimpse of it in all 45 years of marriage, never heard Thomas utter a single word about its existence. No one knew it existed. Neither Robert nor Clara had ever laid eyes on it. Thomas had never once brought it up to his wife, nor to his own parents before they passed away. No one had touched it for over 40 years, left untouched on that dust-free shelf, waiting patiently through every passing season. She crouched down slowly, her old knees clicking softly with age as she lowered herself toward the wooden shelf, joints stiff from years of arthritis and bending over garden beds each summer. She reached out with trembling fingers and brushed the thick layer of dust from the lid of the iron box, the fine gray powder sliding away like fine velvet beneath her touch. The metal surface beneath the dust was cold and dense, heavier than such a tiny box had any right to be. The moment her fingertips fully met the frigid metal surface, her chest tightened sharply, a sharp ache twisting around her heart that made her struggle to draw in a full breath. She tested the small brass lock tentatively with one finger. It wasn't fastened tight at all, merely looped loosely over the clasp without clicking shut. Just a light twist of her thumb. Click. The tarnished metal lock sprang open with a faint, hollow sound that echoed through the silent attic. Her heart sank straight down into her stomach, a cold weight settling deep inside her. Inside the box was no glinting gold coins, no polished diamond jewelry wrapped in silk, no faded sepia old photographs tucked into protective sleeves. Just a single thin yellow envelope, lying quietly flat at the very bottom of the iron container, as if it had been waiting patiently for a very long time, preserved and hidden away solely for her eyes alone. No address scrawled across the front, no handwritten signature at the bottom flap, no date marked in the corner to tell her when it had been sealed shut. Only a single line of handwriting she knew intimately, recognizable at a single glance. Thomas's neat, steady script, the same careful hand she had seen on countless holiday letters, grocery lists and private diary pages over the years. Every pen stroke was carefully formed, slow and deliberate, as if he had written each word with a steady hand and a heart heavy with unbearable weight he could not share with anyone living. On the front of the envelope, just 5 plain, unadorned words. For Eleanor, after I leave. Eleanor's eyes reddened instantly, hot stinging tears welling up behind her lids before she could blink them away. Her throat swelled tight, thick with unspoken emotion that threatened to spill over into quiet sobs. Thomas had prepared this letter long before his unexpected illness and death, writing it and sealing it away decades early. He had hidden it deep within the locked attic, planning for the day he would be gone from her side, waiting for the moment she would stumble upon it entirely on her own, with no guidance or explanation from him. But why hide it away for all those years instead of handing it to her directly while he was still alive? Was he afraid she would read its heavy words too soon, swallowed by overwhelming grief long before his time came? Was he afraid he lacked the courage to speak the secrets written on those pages to her face, unable to meet her eyes while admitting the pain he carried alone for half a century? 100 tangled questions swirled through her mind, each one heavier than the last, yet there was no one left to answer them. Her fingers shook even more violently as she carefully slipped the letter out from inside the fragile envelope, holding the thin edged paper as gently as if it might crumble to dust at the slightest rough movement. The paper was brittle to the touch, its edges darkened and brown with age, every folded crease thin and worn, nearly splitting apart after decades sealed inside the iron box. The ink had faded soft and pale with the passing years but remained fully legible. Every sharp pen stroke seemed carved into the paper, rather than merely written across its surface, pressed down hard by a man carrying a crushing burden. She unfolded the paper slowly, smoothing out its jagged folds with shaky palms, and when she read the very first line scrawled across the top of the page, all the blood in her body seemed to turn cold, icy dread spreading through every vein and leaving her numb from head to toe. Chapter 3, The Hidden Family Regret. The letter was long, 3 full pages. Thomas's handwriting remained neat, but as she read on, the strokes grew tighter and heavier, as if the writer had pressed down harder with each word to keep the emotion from spilling off the page. It was not a love letter, not a will. It was a secret a man had carried alone for 50 years and now, finally, he had written it down, like pulling a red-hot coal from his chest and placing it on paper. 50 years ago, before Thomas ever met Eleanor, he had a younger sister named Lily. Lily was 3 years younger than Thomas. She was a bright, spirited girl, like a little sun. She had extraordinarily gifted hands. At 5, she could draw an entire breathing forest with crayons. At 7, she drew a peacock in chalk on the yard pavement that made the neighbors stop and stare. She loved colors, lines, everything that could come alive on canvas. At 18, she ranked among the top 10 in the city and earned admission to the finest art college. The day her acceptance letter arrived, she spun around the yard, laughing until tears streamed down her face. She shouted, "Brother! I'm going to be an artist. I'm going to study painting." Thomas remembered that day. The sunlight had been brilliant, and his sister's smile outshone it. But that same year, disaster fell over the family like a black cloth. Their father was diagnosed with a severe heart condition requiring immediate, expensive surgery. The family's savings were wiped out, and it still wasn't enough. Thomas had just graduated, working a modest job at a small firm, saving every penny to propose to Eleanor. And Lily's college tuition was, in those days, an astronomical sum. No one asked Lily to make a choice. But that 18-year-old girl, late one night, quietly made a decision that would change her life forever. She hid the acceptance letter inside her sketchbook. The next morning at breakfast, she told the family calmly, "I've thought about it carefully. I'm not that interested in painting anymore. I want to work in a factory and earn money to help the family." Thomas remembered their father weeping. Their mother held Lily and sobbed. But Lily just smiled and said, "It's okay. I'm young. I can always paint later if I want to." She smiled so easily, as if she truly didn't care. Thomas believed her. He would regret, countless times afterward, how blind he had been, how he had missed that brief glint of tears in her eyes. The next day, Lily packed a few clothes and reported to a textile mill. She stood before machines from dawn till dusk, working 12 or 14 hours a day. The delicate fingers that once held paintbrushes grew thick, rough, cracked calluses. She sent every penny home. Her father's medical bills, the household expenses, even the money for the new suit Thomas wore to his wedding, all of it came from the hours she stood on that factory floor. But no one knew. Thomas always believed his sister had simply lost interest in studying and chosen an easy path. He felt a flicker of regret from time to time but never questioned it. He was busy with work, busy with love, busy planning his wedding. He spoke less and less to his sister. 2 years later, the family's fortunes improved. Their father recovered. Thomas married. Eleanor became pregnant. New life flowed warm and smooth as spring water. But Lily's health had shattered. Years of grueling labor and suppressed sorrow had plunged her into severe depression. She began lying awake all night. At the factory, she would suddenly stare blankly at the machines, tears streaming down her face. She told no one. She was afraid of being a burden. One rainy night exactly like tonight, she packed a small bag with a few clothes and an old paintbrush. She pushed open the front door quietly and stepped into the rain. She never came back. She was 20 years old. The family searched frantically, posting notices, visiting police stations, scouring every factory and station in the city. 6 months. Nothing. Lily had vanished like a drop of water into dry air. In the end, they had to accept the unacceptable. She was gone forever. After Lily disappeared, Thomas found her hidden admission letter and half-finished diary tucked inside an old sketchbook. He read the diary. He knelt on the floor of his sister's empty room and wept until he could make no sound. He finally learned the truth. His brilliant, radiant sister had sacrificed her dreams, her youth, her entire life for the family. And he, her older brother, had lived smoothly. Fell in love, married, had children, got promoted. He had been peacefully happy, and he had never once asked her, "Sister, are you happy?" Guilt crushed him like a mountain. It never lifted for 50 years. He dared not tell his parents they were old and couldn't bear the late-coming regret. He dared not tell his children they were too young to understand the bleeding wound in the family's depths. And above all, he dared not tell Eleanor he couldn't bear to see pity in her eyes. So he carried it alone. He locked all of Lily's things, sketchbooks, an unfinished self-portrait, an old paintbrush, and this letter inside the attic. He forbade anyone to touch them, forbade anyone to ask. He buried the key in the most hidden drawer, like pressing a burning coal into the deepest part of his heart. On the surface, all was calm. But inside, it burned forever. For 50 years, he woke on rainy nights and sat by the bed staring into the dark until dawn. Every spring, When he saw young girls carrying sketchbooks down the street, he would stop and watch for a long, aching moment until they disappeared from view. He never spoke Lily's name, but that name was carved into every breath he took. He never forgave himself. Chapter 4, The Unfinished Wish. When she finished reading the last line, Eleanor sat cross-legged on the dusty attic floor, her back propped against a stack of aged cardboard boxes, tears streaming silently down her lined cheeks without pause. 1 drop, 2, 3 they slipped past her jawbone and plopped onto the thin yellowed letter paper, spreading small dark, blurry stains across Thomas's faded handwriting. She wept without sound, no broken sobs or whimpers escaping her throat, yet her shoulders shook violently with every suppressed wave of grief, her whole frame trembling as if a cold autumn wind cut straight through her bones. Around her, the attic air remained deathly quiet. The steady patter of rain against the wrong attic window sounded distant now, muffled by the thick fog of sorrow wrapping tight around her heart. She folded her legs inward, drawing her knees close to her chest, and rested the crumpled letter atop them, unable to bear setting it down on the dust-strewn floor. She had been married to Thomas for 54 years, half a century of shared mornings, quiet dinners, hard winters and blooming spring rose gardens side by side. For decades, she had firmly believed she knew every single layer of his soul, his endless gentle kindness toward every stray cat that wandered the yard, his quiet, brooding moods that would settle over him for days with no clear cause, his frequent bouts of sleeplessness that left him staring at the bedroom ceiling long after midnight, and his strange, unexplainable soft warmth toward any young artists he crossed paths with, on the street or in town. Once, a local gallery held a watercolor exhibition downtown, and she playfully teased him over afternoon tea, stirring sugar into his mug as she smiled. "You're even more interested in art exhibitions than I am. Did you want to be a painter when you were young?" At the time, Thomas would just offer a faint, distant smile, reach out to ruffle her graying hair tenderly, and fall completely silent, never offering a single explanation to satisfy her curiosity. She brushed it off as a fleeting childhood fancy he'd long abandoned, never guessing the raw, buried grief hiding behind that evasive smile. Now every small, forgotten detail clicked sharply into place, and she finally understood the truth. Behind every soft smile he'd given her, behind every quiet pause and distant gaze, lay a 50-year-old knife wound buried deep inside his chest, one that never fully scabbed over, never stopped throbbing with unshakable guilt. He had never once spoken Lily's name in all their years together, never whispered it in his sleep, never let the word slip in a vulnerable moment, but his heart had carried his lost sister with him every single day, in every quiet thought and every unspoken longing. One by one, 1,000 tiny, overlooked moments from their shared life flooded her mind, fragments she had casually brushed aside back then, now glowing heavy with hidden sorrow. In their very first year of marriage, a restless midnight had woken her from light sleep. The space beside her in the bed was cold and empty, Thomas nowhere to be found. She slipped on her wool slippers and padded down the dim upstairs hallway to the study door, and through the narrow crack, she spotted his rigid silhouette standing fixed at the tall bay window, his back fully turned toward her, his broad shoulders trembling slightly under his flannel nightshirt. Back then, she foolishly assumed he was tangled up in work stress, weighed down by endless client deadlines and household bills, and chose not to interrupt his solitude, tiptoeing back to bed and leaving him to his quiet suffering alone. The second year of their marriage, the doctor confirmed she was carrying Robert, and Thomas had been wild with unbridled joy. He lifted her light frame off the ground and spun her round and round the living room, left her loud and bright enough to fill every corner of the cottage. But that exact same night, she woke to an empty bed once more. She wandered to the spare room they'd prepared as a nursery, and there he stood, frozen at the empty wooden crib, his hands clamped so tight around the doorframe that his knuckles blanched pure white beneath his skin, his eyes fixed blankly on the unlined mattress inside. In that moment long ago, she had naively thought he was simply overwhelmed with pure happiness, overcome by the miracle of their incoming child. Now, as she sat clutching his letter amid attic dust, she understood the terrible truth: he had not been thinking of their unborn son at all. His mind was wandering back to Lily, his bright, talented younger sister, the girl who'd vanished into a rainy night at only 20 years old, robbed of every chance to build an ordinary, warm, happy life of her own. Eleanor's mind spun with endless unanswerable questions. If Lily had never sacrificed her art school dreams, would she have met a kind, gentle partner who loved her endlessly? Would she have filled a nursery of her own with laughing children, surrounded by paintbrushes and endless canvases? Would she have planted rows of roses outside her own front door, just as Thomas had done for their family? Every hypothetical thought twisted her heart tighter, a sharp ache spreading through her ribs. Her grip on the aged letter tightened instinctively, her fingers curling hard around the brittle paper until its worn creases strained, threatening to tear apart beneath her trembling palms. She slowed her breathing, forcing herself to carefully unfold the crumpled bottom section to reread the final lines. Words scrawled in wildly trembling strokes, uneven, slanted. Some letters blurred into smudged gray patches that could only be streaks of Thomas's own tears, shed as he sat alone writing this confession decades earlier. He had written, "Eleanor, if you read this after I'm gone, please forgive my lifelong silence. I have spent every day repenting for my ignorance and blindness. I never dared to find Lily, because I had no right to face her. I don't know if she still hates me, or if she's well, or if I even deserve to call her sister anymore. But Eleanor, at the end of my life, I have only one wish. Find my sister Lily. Tell her we are sorry. Tell her her sacrifice was never forgotten. Tell her her family has waited for her for 50 years. If she is still alive, bring her home. Let her know she is deeply loved. Let her know her brother never spent a single day without thinking of her. This is the only unfinished regret of my life." Eleanor pressed the fragile letter firm against her chest, the rough paper digging softly into her heart as hot tears soaked straight through the collar of her knitted cardigan, leaving damp dark splotches across the wool fabric. Her heart ached and burned all at once, a strange dual pain, as if someone had squeezed it hard enough to crush every soft memory inside, then slowly, gently let go, leaving behind a hollow, throbbing emptiness that nothing could fill. This secret locked away in the dusty attic was not a terrifying scandal, not a shameful crime or hidden betrayal. It was the softest, tenderest, yet heaviest weight of quiet love a man could carry trapped inside himself for an entire lifetime. For 50 long years, Thomas had tossed and turned awake every single night, drowning in endless guilt that gnawed away at his peace without mercy. Every time he watched Robert and Clara grow up healthy, chase their dreams, build happy lives in the city, his thoughts would instantly drift to Lily, the teenage girl who willingly surrendered all her own hopes and talent to save their family. Every rainy autumn night, when gray skies and heavy downpour shrouded the cottage, his mind would replay the image of 20-year-old Lily walking out their front door into endless darkness, never to return. He locked the attic door, hidden the iron box, sealed his secret away from everyone he loved, and traded 50 years of his own unburdened happiness for the family's surface peace, carrying all that silent pain alone with no shoulder to lean on. What struck Eleanor most bitterly was that through every year of self-torment, he had never once wept for his own suffering. He never allowed himself a moment of mercy, never whispered a single comforting thought to ease his burden, never told himself, "It wasn't your fault." He'd spent half a century punishing himself for a choice Lily had made freely out of love, taking all the blame onto his own shoulders without pause. That entire night, Eleanor could not close her eyes to sleep. She dragged a wooden dining chair over to the bedroom bay window and sat there for hours long after midnight, watching the endless sheets of rain streak down the cold glass pane, each vertical water trail resembling countless silent, unspoken tears. Her hand never loosened its hold on Thomas's letter, keeping it clutched safely against her lap as if releasing it would mean losing the last piece of his unspoken heart. Her thumb traced over Thomas's looping signature at the bottom of the page again and again, slow, gentle strokes memorizing every curve of his handwriting as rain continued to drum against the roof above. As the hours slipped by, one single thought grew clearer and stronger in her heart with every passing minute, solidifying into an unbreakable promise she swore to uphold. She would dedicate whatever remaining years she had left on this earth to fulfilling Thomas's unfinished, dying wish without hesitation. She would track Lily down, no matter how far the search stretched, no matter how many dead ends or faded old leaves blocked her path. Wherever Lily might be hiding, whether she welcomed their arrival or turned them away out of old hurt, Eleanor would stand before her face to face and deliver every word Thomas had begged her to share. Your brother loved you all his life. He regretted every single day without you. He waited for you faithfully for 50 long years. Slowly, as the first faint hints of dawn began to creep over the treetops outside the window, the heavy autumn rain finally sputtered to a complete stop. A thin, delicate line of pale golden sunlight split open the dark gray clouds along the eastern horizon, spilling soft, warm streaks across the rain-soaked wooden rooftops of the neighborhood, glinting off puddles left behind by the storm like a quiet, gentle promise that better days and long overdue reunions lay ahead. Chapter 5, The Old Trace and the Warm Turn. The next morning, Eleanor called her two children home. Robert and Clara sat on the living room sofa, watching their mother with red-rimmed eyes, a yellowed envelope in her hands. They knew something important was coming. Eleanor took a deep breath and told them the story of Lily from beginning to end. She spoke slowly, her voice catching sometimes, stopping for a sip of water before continuing. The room fell silent for a full 2 minutes. Only the old grandfather clock ticked, each beat landing on their hearts. Robert spoke first, his voice rough. We have an aunt. Clara covered her mouth, her eyes already wet. Dad never mentioned her. Not once. When I was little, I asked him if he had any brothers or sisters. He said no. The siblings exchanged a look of shock, grief, and a heavy, aching guilt. They began frantically piecing together every detail of their father's life that they had once dismissed as trivial. Now those scattered fragments snapped together like beads on a string, forming a necklace too heavy to wear. Robert remembered the time he brought home a watercolor painting from school. His father had looked at it for a long, long time, then carefully tucked it into a book, his eyes slightly reddened. Robert had proudly assumed his father was just deeply moved. Clara remembered that every year, on his birthday, their father would lock himself in his study for an hour. She once pushed the door open a crack and saw him staring at an old photograph. She asked her mother about it. Her mother only said, "Your father is remembering the past." They never asked who was in that photograph. And the rainy days their father would always sit silently by the window, a cup of tea growing cold in his hands. And the way he always looked twice at young people carrying sketchbooks. And the old, unused paintbrush at the bottom of his desk drawer. All those faded fragments, worn smooth by years of neglect, now stood out sharp and clear. Robert stood up first, his voice carrying a rare resolve. "Mom, we have to find Aunt Lily. Dad waited his whole life. We can't let him wait any longer." Clara nodded firmly. "I'll take leave from work. However long it takes, I'm in." Eleanor looked at her two grown children, and a warm tide rose in her chest. She felt, suddenly, that Thomas had been watching them all along, waiting for this moment. The family began the search that very day. The clues were almost nothing. A black and white photo of Lily at 18, smiling with light in her eyes. The name of a textile mill that had long since closed and been demolished. A year of disappearance. That was all. But Robert and Clara didn't give up. Robert combed through city archives, old household registration offices, newspaper libraries. Clara posted search notices online and contacted local volunteer search organizations. They even found a retired police clerk, who put on his reading glasses and spent hours flipping through yellow ledgers until his fingers were gray with dust. 10 days of searching. Every day felt like a stone dropped into a bottomless well. Eleanor lay awake at night, clutching the letter, whispering over and over, "Thomas, if you're still here, give me a sign." On the 11th night, Clara's phone call came through. Her voice was shaking so hard it cracked. Tears and joy tangled together. "Mom, we found her. And Lily is alive. She's in a small town 3 hours away. She runs a little painting studio, teaches children to paint. She's been there for 50 years. On the other end of the line, Eleanor's sobs broke free like a boulder that had pressed on her heart for half a century finally cracking open. On the other line, Robert heard it too. He crouched on the floor, face in his hands, shoulders heaving. The girl who had sacrificed everything for her family, who had vanished into a rainy night at 20, had never hated anyone. She had chosen the quietest way to life, growing old with her paintbrushes. She never went to art school, but she painted all her life. She taught generation after generation of children in that small town. Every painting was her light. She never came back, not because she resented the family, but because she knew her brother had started a new life. She was afraid that her reappearance would pain him, burden him, make him feel guilty. She chose loneliness. She chose to let go. That night, no one in the family slept. Each of them lay awake under the same sky, feeling the same waves of sorrow, regret, gratitude, and an urgent, trembling hope. Chapter 6. The Attic Secret finally blooms warmth. On a bright, warm morning, sunlight poured down like golden honey, spilling unobstructed from a cloudless sapphire sky and wrapping every road, field and roadside tree in soft glowing warmth. The air carried a light sweet breeze that chased away all the damp gray gloom of the long rainy days they endured back at the old wooden house, and Eleanor rolled down the car window to breathe it in deeply, her heart thrumming with a tangled mix of nervousness, hope and quiet trepidation. Beside her, Robert gripped the steering wheel steadily, his jaw tight with suppressed emotion, while Clara twisted a crumpled printed photo of young Lily between her fingers in the back seat, rereading the scribbled address of the small town over and over to calm her racing thoughts. Neither of them had slept well the night before, each haunted by the weight of their father's 50-year-old regret, clinging to the fragile hope that this long-awaited meeting would mend a wound left open for half a century. Eleanor, Robert, and Clara drove 3 hours to the small town. It was a quiet place untouched by the bustle of modern big city construction, with towering ancient plane trees lining every narrow street, their thick lush green leaves rustling in the gentle breeze to cast dappled shifting shadows across the cobblestone roads below. The air carried a rich, comforting scent of freshly baked sourdough bread and warm butter from a corner bakery with a chipped cream storefront. The baker had set wooden benches outside his door, and paper bags stuffed with pastries sat stacked on the windowsill. Occasionally a child, on a rusted second-hand bicycle, laughed loud and bright as he pedaled past, chasing a fluttering yellow butterfly down the lane, the jingle of his tiny bell echoing long after he vanished around a bend. Small white clover bloomed along every curb, and elderly locals sat on wooden porch chairs, knitting or tending potted herbs, greeting strangers with slow, gentle nods. There was none of the hurried cold rush they'd grown used to in the city. They turned into a narrow, winding lane hidden between 2 rows of weathered stone cottages, far from the main street's faint hum. At the end of it stood a small weathered wooden studio built from pale cedar planks, its roof tiled with faded terracotta shingles softened by decades of wind and rain. There was no tall stone wall around the yard to block the view, only a low hand-carved wooden fence woven thick with twisting climbing roses and emerald ivy vines that tangled loosely along every rail. Beneath the twisting vines spread a boundless sea of roses, deep scarlet, soft blush pink, creamy ivory, layered and lush, heavy full blooms swaying slowly in the sunlight as if dancing to an unheard melody. Their fragrance hung thick and sweet in the air, rich and heady, as if someone had gathered thousands of fully opened rose blossoms and distilled their entire gentle perfume into the wind that swept through the yard. Eleanor's chest tightened the second the scent wrapped around her, an immediate familiar ache blooming soft and warm inside her ribs. Eleanor's eyes welled up at the sight. These roses grew in exactly the same clustered, untamed way as the rose thickets she had planted and tended in her own yard for 40 years, bred from the exact cuttings Thomas had brought home all those springs ago. She suddenly remembered a passing, offhand remark Thomas had made when they were newly married, sitting side by side on their porch watching the first rosebuds unfurl. "My sister loved roses most of all. She'd spend whole afternoons sketching every bloom she found as a girl." Back then, she merely smiled and nodded, assuming it was a fleeting memory of some distant childhood playmate, never stopping to wonder which sister he spoke of, never guessing the heavy grief hidden behind that casual sentence. All those trivial overlooked words, buried under decades of ordinary domestic chatter, now surged back to her mind sharp and clear. The studio door stood half open on its rusted brass hinges, swaying slightly with every soft gust of wind. Through the thin gap came the warm, quiet sharp scent of turpentine, blended with sweet linseed oil and vivid watercolor paint, a fragrance Eleanor instantly recognized as the same faint aroma that clung to Thomas's coat every time he'd wandered past art shops downtown. In the sun-dappled yard sat an elderly woman with flowing silver hair tied loosely back with a faded silk ribbon, her head bent low over a large unfinished oil painting propped up on a wooden easel. Her back was slightly stooped from years of bending over canvases, but her aged hands remained surprisingly steady and gentle as she swept her paintbrush across the canvas in slow, deliberate motions. Her brush strokes were warm and bright, layered soft hues of peach, sky blue and pale green that blended smooth as water, her color palette clear and pure as a mountain spring stream glinting under sunlight. Eleanor leaned forward slightly, squinting through the rose vines to study her features, and her breath caught in her throat. Her profile, the soft gentle curve of her eyes, the faint arch of her brow, the slight tilt of her jaw was exactly like the crumpled young black and white portrait Thomas had carried tucked safely in his leather wallet all those years, the photograph he'd never let anyone else see. There was no room left for doubt, no lingering flicker of uncertainty swirling in Eleanor's mind. It was Lily. The old woman seemed to sense the weight of 3 pairs of eyes fixed upon her, a faint quiet awareness creeping over her shoulders before she even lifted her head. She looked up slowly, her paintbrush suspended mid-air above the canvas, and when her gaze landed on the elderly woman standing at her wooden gate and the 2 young people lingering gently behind her, she went completely still, frozen rigid as if struck by a bolt of lightning straight to the chest. The wooden paintbrush slipped loose from her slackened fingers, clattering down against the easel's wooden base and dragging a long messy blue streak across the half-finished landscape canvas like a beautiful, tender dream abruptly cut short mid-thought. She recognized them instantly. 30 years prior, she'd snuck across the street to watch Thomas and Eleanor in their garden, memorizing every line of their faces. Over the decades, she'd collected old family holiday photos she'd quietly requested from distant relatives, tucking them into the back of her sketchbook to look at on lonely rainy evenings. She knew exactly who Eleanor was, who Robert and Clara were, what they represented, the family she'd walked away from half a century earlier. 50 years of endless distance, suppressed longing and quiet hidden grief rushed back over her like a breaking tidal wave in that single silent instant. Her thin weathered lips began to tremble uncontrollably, and her hands clamped down hard on the frayed linen apron tied around her waist so tightly her knuckles blanched stark white. Beneath wrinkled skin, every tendon standing out sharp with suppressed emotion she'd bottled up alone for a lifetime. Eleanor pushed open the little wooden gate with a soft creak, stepping forward slowly across the moss-covered stone path lined with tiny rose seedlings. Her steps were slow and deliberate, yet steady, Unwavering as if she was walking toward a long overdue reunion both she and Thomas had waited half a lifetime to witness, carrying the weight of his unspoken heart with every footstep. She knelt down carefully on the cool grass dotted with fallen rose petals, ignoring the faint ache shooting through her arthritic knees, took Lily's wrinkled but still surprisingly soft hands into her own palms, and gently placed the folded yellowed letter from the iron box into Lily's palm. Then she closed Lily's trembling fingers firmly over the aged paper and patted them softly, a quiet silent gesture of comfort and understanding. Your brother waited for you for 50 years. He regretted for 50 years. He never forgot you. Lily looked down at the familiar looping handwriting covering the envelope's surface, the script etched permanently into her memory from childhood notes Thomas had slipped her when they were small. Her shaky fingers traced the 5 words scrawled across the front for Eleanor, after I leave slowly, inch by inch, as if touching Thomas's very spirit through the faded ink. Her lips parted as if she meant to speak, but no sound escaped her throat, only a thin shaky breath. Hot silent tears fell one after another onto the brittle paper, leaving fresh dark damp blossoms that blended seamlessly with the old faded tear stains Eleanor had left behind in the attic days prior, 2 generations of sorrow merging on the same page. Finally, she lifted her head and laughed thickly through streaming tears, shaking her head gently from side to side as she let the crushing weight of 50 years of secrecy lift off her shoulders. Her voice was hoarse from decades of quiet loneliness and unspoken words, but warm and soft and filled with a quiet, profound release she'd never thought she'd feel in her lifetime. I never blamed him. That path was my own choice. I lost college, but I never lost painting. All these years I've lived a good life. Truly. She raised one trembling hand and gestured slowly toward the endless blooming roses sprawling across her yard, her eyes glistening with soft tears. I plant roses every single spring, just as he did back home. I knew my brother loved these flowers more than anything, so I filled every corner of my small yard with them to feel close to him. I came to see you once 30 years ago, on a bright Saturday afternoon in early May. I stood hidden across the street behind the tall hedge, watching him kneel in your garden watering the rose bushes, his sleeves rolled up to his elbows. You walked out of the back door with a steaming mug of tea in your hands, and he turned to you with that same gentle smile I remembered from childhood. Then I left quietly before anyone spotted me. I only needed to know he was happy, settled with a loving wife and growing children. That was enough for me to carry on all these years, enough to keep painting and living without resentment. The whole sunlit yard fell into a soft, tender silence after her words faded away. Only the light wind stirred through thousands of rose leaves, creating a gentle rustling whisper, mixed with the soft muffled sound of barely suppressed quiet sobs from all 3 visitors. Robert and Clara stood side by side behind their mother, their eyes bright red and glistening with tears, yet both wore faint, wobbly smiles of relief and affection. Clara stepped forward first, her voice soft and tender as she spoke, careful not to break the fragile peaceful atmosphere hanging over the garden. And Lily, I'm Clara. This is Robert. Dad always missed you, every single day of his life. He never stopped talking about you, even if he never said your name out loud. Lily reached out with trembling aged hands, first brushing a gentle palm against Clara's cheek, then resting her fingers lightly on Robert's shoulder, studying their faces closely as fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. She whispered barely loud enough for them to hear, all thick in her tone, so like him. Your eyes, your quiet kindness so very like him. The heavy secret locked away in the dusty attic for 40 years was finally no longer a haunting shadow, no longer a gnawing lifelong regret buried in silence. It stood revealed as the deepest, most unselfish love, the quietest lifelong sacrifice, and the most tender, long-delayed homecoming any family could ever receive. That warm golden afternoon, Lily locked the door of her little art studio for good. She packed only a handful of simple cotton clothes folded neatly into a worn canvas satchel, and the frayed old paintbrush with splattered dried pigment she had clutched and used for most of her life, the very same brush she'd taken with her when she fled into the rain 50 years prior. She twisted the brass lock shut and tucked the spare house key under a chipped clay flower pot overflowing with pink rosebuds by the doorframe, then walked next door to inform her elderly neighbor who checked on her daily for decades. "I'm going home, back to the cottage where I grew up. I won't be coming back here anymore." She climbed into the back seat of the car beside Eleanor, settling in gently and gazing out the window as they drove slowly out of the quiet town. As the cedar studio and its rose-filled yard shrank into the distance behind them, she looked back once over her shoulder, a soft peaceful smile curving her lips. 50 years of wandering, lonely self-imposed exile had come to an end. She was finally going back to the place where she'd grown up, to the family she'd grieved and loved from afar all her life. When they arrived back at the Hale family cottage as dusk painted the sky soft peach and lavender, the attic door stood wide open for the first time in 40 years, no lock to bar its entrance. Warm golden sunset sunlight poured straight through the grimy round attic window, flooding every dusty shadowed corner with bright light and chasing away decades of trapped darkness. Over the next 2 days, Eleanor and Lily worked side by side to drag all the stacked old cardboard boxes out of the attic, wiping every surface clean of accumulated dust with damp linen cloths. They carried Lily's unfinished teenage self-portrait down from the highest storage shelf, the canvas faded but still vivid, and hung it prominently on the living room's central wall. Directly beside it, they framed and mounted Thomas's youthful black and white photograph pulled from his old wallet, the same portrait he'd guarded for half a century. Brother and sister separated by 50 long years of distance, silence and hidden sorrow finally stood side by side again, framed together where the whole family could see them each day. Thomas's lifelong crushing regret, 3 years after he'd drawn his last breath, had finally bloomed into the softest, warmest light imaginable, held gently in the hands of every person who had loved him deeply, bound together by the quiet, enduring love that had outlasted half a century of separation. Ending, warm closing. In many families, there are secrets buried beneath the years. They are not frightening mysteries. They are love that was never spoken, sacrifices made in silence, apologies that came too late. Time hides the truth, but it never hides the warmth. Every locked door in life, when finally opened, will release not darkness but the most moving light of home. Eleanor folded Thomas's letter carefully and placed it back into the iron box. She set it on the most visible shelf in the living room, where she could see it every day. Sometimes she would speak to it. "Thomas, Lily is home. You can rest now." Lily never left again. She planted more roses in the yard with Eleanor. The two silver-haired women would sit in the garden, one painting, one knitting, sharing the afternoon sun and quiet smiles. Robert and Clara visited more often. On weekends, the old house grew lively again, children chasing butterflies in the yard, adults laughing in the kitchen. The attic door that had been locked for 40 years now stood always open, letting sunlight in every day. Some secrets stay locked for a lifetime. But when they finally open, what comes out is never darkness. It is love.